I want to give thanks to the Aspen Institute for asking me to be here. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories that I think are important to this idea of the wound needing a witness. I got my master's in creative writing in a program that was about 25 folks in it, and I was the only student of Afro descent. I was the only student of an immigrant background. I was the only student from a major urban hub. I was born and raised in New York City. You might be able to tell from my accent. And it was a fascinating space to navigate. I got my undergraduate degree at the George Washington University, so I was familiar with PWIs. Like, this wasn't new to me. But in undergrad, it felt like a lot of the aggressions that I felt were very macro. It was very clear that certain people were coming from backgrounds that were inherited. I understood that. In a creative writing program, where you're submitting poems every week, and you're getting critique back, and it's being circled and question marks, and I'm like, oh, you didn't want to Google that? You didn't want to look that up, right? It's very different, and it feels very personal. And I'm going to give you all an example. One day, my professor came to class, and he's like this old school, like Robert Frost in the face, like long beard, right? And he's like, I just read the most amazing poem about deer. And y'all, I have no beef with deer, right? Like, I am not here to hate on anybody's wildlife. I think venison is delicious. Like, that was not my issue. I do think there is this stereotype in the literary arts of what symbols, right, are good enough to write about. And the deer and the clouds and certain flowers are one of them, right? And this professor, because grad school classes are long, for 2.5 hours goes on about this deer. But then he took it one step further. And he wanted everyone in the room to go around and say, if they were to write an animal ode, and an ode is a praise poem, right? What animal they would pick and why. And so it goes to one classmate, and my classmate is like, well, like Elizabeth Bishop, I would write about the blackbird. And I'm like, we saw that joint 13 times. Like, promise me. Like, you don't need to do the blackbird again. He goes to another classmate, he's like, I would write about sea anemones. And I'm Googling on the table, like, what is a sea anemone? Why would we write about that, right? And then my professor gets to me. And it's my first year of grad school. I'm like, okay, they always say, write what you know. I'm trying to be, like, impress this person. I'm like, I would write about rats. Because if you grow up in any major city, you know you some rats, right? You know, pigeons are just rats with wings. You know, squirrels are just rats with nice coats. They're all rats. And we know them well. And in front of all of my classmates, in a space I often already felt isolated, my professor looked at me and laughed. And he said, rats are not noble enough creatures for a poem. Liz, I think you need more experiences. So I wrote this piece. It's called Rat Ode. It is my official clap back to that professor. But mainly it serves as a reminder for any of us who have ever been told our stories are too small, or too ugly, or too little for high art, right? That we are all deserving of poetry. To the rat. Because you are not the admired nightingale. Because you are not the noble doe. Because you are not the picturesque ermine, armadillo, or bat. They have been written. And I don't know their song like I know your scuttling between walls. The scent of your collapsed corpse rotting beneath floorboards. Your frantic squeal as you pull at your own fur from glue traps, ripping flesh from skin in an attempt to survive. Because in July of '97, you birthed a legion on 109th, sworn from behind the dumpsters, made our streets infamous for something other than crack. Shoot, we nicknamed you Cat Killer. Raced with you through open hydrants, squeaked like you when Siete blasted aluminum bat into your brethren's skull. The sound slapped down dominoes. You reigned that summer rat. And even when they sent exterminators, half dead and on fire, you pushed on. Because even though you are an inelegant, simple, mammal bottom feeder, always freaking famished, little ugly thing who feasts on what crumbs fall from the corners of our mouths, you live uncuddled, uncoddled, can't be bought at Petco and fed to fat snakes because you are not the maze rat of labs, pale, pretty-eyed, trained. You raise yourself, sharp fang, clawed, scarred, patched dark because of this. He should love you. But look at the beast, the professor tells me. The table is already full, and rat, you are not a right-worthy thing. Every time they say that, take your gutter, your dirt coat, filth this page, rat. Scrape your underbelly against streets, concrete. You better squeak and raise the whole world, rat. Let loose a plague of words, rat, and remind them that you, that I, we are worthy of every poem. Here. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. What I wish I'd known then was that eventually I would have to turn this poem in, right, at my thesis defense. And so my thesis defense comes around, and I'm like, I'm gonna tuck this into the back. Maybe he won't see it, right? And I'm sitting in the defense, and it's this professor who was the head of the department, right? So the person who like signs off on whether or not I graduate, and two other professors. And we're 58 minutes in, got 2 minutes left, right? I'm like, Mom, I made it, I'm good, right? And he goes, Liz, I have one last question. I'm like, all right. He's like, about this rap poem. I'm like, no, right? Like, and I'm like, okay. And he says, it's quite clever, but what inspired it? Right? And it's that moment where you're like, you, bruh, you inspired it. But you're also like, all right, I need to graduate. So you're like, oh, man, inspiration comes in all kinds of ways. And it's funny, but it's also, it's this like dissonance, right? Because it was humorous, but also this moment where I realized, wow, someone could say something that fundamentally changed how I wrote, right? That I decided to write the rap from that moment forward, that I realized that not everyone is my reader. But had I been a different, come from a different background or come from somewhere else, that could have really crushed what I thought I could write about. That I think there's something insidious in the ways with which we redline and gentrify and push people into certain neighborhoods and then tell them that the cultural markers that they grow up with, the cultural currency that they have, isn't something they can use in certain settings. That to tell someone in a body like mine, which is a descendant of colonialization, which is a descendant of hegemony, right? To tell someone like me, you must write about nobility. What access do I have to nobility? And I'm talking about actual official nobility, right? Like aristocracy. What access do I have? Then what do I write about? If that is the only thing you tell me is worthy of a poem. That I think about the spaces I work in that are very much institutions that they've been told what they can and can't say. I worked at a juvenile detention facility here in DC. I worked there for 1.5 years, mostly working with young women. And 2 years before that, I had worked at a middle school. I taught 8th grade English. And I was told very specifically what my students could write about. And I would go into those spaces, and I would give them these prompts. And my students had very specific things they wanted to say, and it had nothing to do with these prompts, right? And I would get so frustrated that they were making me look bad, that they weren't fulfilling the assignment, that I didn't know how to grade this according to a standard because they weren't following directions. The majority of the girls in the program that I taught at the juvenile detention facility had come from abandonment. So they grew up with no parents, right? Or with a parent that came and went. I would say that 7 out of 10 in every group, and the group changed continuously, had a sexual assault encounter at some point, had domestic violence as a part of their life. Oftentimes they were there for things like truancy, so not going to school or after hours being outside, or they were there for shoplifting, or there for misdemeanors that in any other neighborhood, right, wouldn't have resulted in them staying at a detention facility for weeks. And they came back, right? Adjudicated youth centers are interesting because they're usually in an in-between spot. But I would see these girls throughout the 1.5 years over and over. And one day it really hit me. I was so frustrated. I'd asked this student to just write this one thing, and she was acting out. And she goes, I don't want to write poems, right? And I'm like, I'm here trying to do something for you, and you don't want to write poems. And I had to take such a step back in terms of what I believed my role was in that room, because I had it twisted. I thought I was here to save this girl. And that was not my job. It was not my job to tell her what story she could or could not tell, right? She got enough of that. The 1 hour a week that you have poetry class should not be where you get in trouble. When the girl at the detention center asks you again, but why we gotta write these damn poems anyways? Fold back the army knife of your tongue. This is not a place to create more bruises. Teaching creative writing is like convincing skin to graft itself after being wounded. So you should not teach and harm. They must be mutually exclusive. Remember, these are Black and brown girls in America. There is hurt here, inherited or otherwise, and trauma is a tapeworm growing in the gut until it gets so big you have to reach into your throat and pull it out from between your smile. Remember, teaching is not community service. Remember, teaching is not an automatic pass to calling yourself an activist. Remember, you are not here to save lives. We are all working on our own mosaic of aches. So when the girl at the detention center asks you again, but why we gotta write these damn poems anyways? Tell her, we write to remind ourselves we are still here and that we can still heal. One of the things my girls would often want to write about had to do with beauty standards. They were fascinated, and I think oftentimes because they didn't see a lot of folks that didn't come in uniform, they were always fascinated with what I was wearing and like my nail color and like, what did you do to your hair today? Like it was like their magazine once a week for me to come into that space. But there was also this very clear layering, right, or totem pole of beauty that they understood. What are you mixed with, miss? Where's your hair from? You look foreign. There were all of these questions and things that they'd been taught about what a body like mine meant in that space and what it meant in reflection to them, right? That you are pretty because you have this, this, that, and I am not pretty because of this, this, and that. And there was clear dynamics in the space of who could do what. Oh, well, she liked that because she light-skinned, right? There was this like understanding they had of one another. And the program was mostly Black and Latina, right? Like they were all brown women, brown and Black, but they all had a hierarchy. Over the weekend, there was an article tweeted out by Cosmopolitan, which they've since revoked, saying that science and this ancient Greek theorem could determine whether or not someone was considered beautiful. And that they had figured out the top 10 most beautiful women in the world using science and this ancient Greek theorem. There was not one woman of color on the entire list. And so when I would sit in class with these young girls and ask them, like, where did you get this from? Where did you learn this? How did you figure out or like come upon this decision that you weren't beautiful? I often thought it was the house, it was this, it was that, but it's like our whole society tells this myth of what is beautiful. We're gonna go to the Greeks to ask them who they think is beautiful here, right? But that I grew up in a household where there were very clear ideas of what beauty was as well. My parents are both from the Dominican Republic, which is an island nation shared with Haiti, and there's a fascinating relationship with race there. That you cannot be the first place that was ever colonized on this side of the world. You cannot be the place that had the first slaves ever. You cannot be the place that had the first site of Black republic, right, of the first free nation on this side of the world, and not think there's gonna be a contentious relationship with race. That I grew up not being able to call myself Black, although the island is 80% Afro-descendant, because there's this idea that there is no race. We're all just Dominicans. And when people talk about post-racial societies, I think how problematic that can be. Because I think that's the myth they're trying to create in the DR. But it's like, well, only certain people have these positions, and they all look the same. And so we can't say that they're all just Dominicans. There's something else at play. I grew up very, very clear on what aesthetics I had to follow if I was going to be beautiful, if I was going to be classy, if I was going to be elegant. And in my case, and in the Dominican Republic, there's this fascination with hair and with straight hair. And although I go into certain spaces, they're like, oh, I love your hair. I didn't grow up with my hair curly. I grew up straightening it every single week because I was told that that was sophisticated, and that to wear my hair natural wasn't a sign of class. My senior year of college, I fell in love, and my partner is Black American, family from North Carolina, don't speak no Spanish, don't dance no salsa, right? Like, and I told my mom, and she said, but what if you two have children? What about their hair? And that she wasn't trying to be malicious, and that somehow makes it worse. That professor wasn't trying to be malicious, right? That student wasn't. But that there are ways that we learn self-harm that come from these innocent questions. So my mother tells me to fix my hair. And by fix, she means straighten. She means whiten. But how do you fix this shipwrecked history of hair? The true meaning of stranded. When tresses hug tight like African cousins in ship bellies, did they imagine their great-grandchildren would look like us and would hate them how we do? Trying to find ways to erase them out of our skin, to iron them out of our hair, this wild tangle of hair that strangles air. You call them wild curls. I call them breathing. Ancestors spiraling. Can't you see them in this wet hair that waves like hello? And yo, they say Dominicans do the best hair. They can wash, set, flatten the spring in any lock. But what they mean is we're the best at swallowing amnesia. In a cup of morir soñando, die dreaming, because we'd rather do that than live in this reality caught between orange juice and milk, between reflections of the sun and whiteness. What they mean is, why would you date a black man? What they mean is a prieto cocolo. What they mean is, why would two oppressed people come together? It's 2 times the trouble. What they really mean is, have you thought of your daughter's hair? And I don't tell them that we love like sugar cane. Brown skin, pale flesh, meshed in pure sweetness, the children of fields. Our bodies curve into one another like an echo, and I let my curtain of curls blanket us from the world. How our children will be beautiful, of dust skin and diamond eyes, hair of reclamation. How I will braid pride down their backs, so from the moment they leave the womb, they will be born in love with themselves. My mother tells me to fix my hair, and so many words remain unspoken because all I can reply is, you can't fix what was never broken. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My mother's actually a lovely woman. I think that's like really important to say, right? That we all carry prejudice, and we just have to be aware of challenging them, right? And undoing them. That there's no one who doesn't have any prejudice. But what does it mean to work on that? I only have like one last thing to say, and it's the stories I chose to tell today are ones that have very specific cultural markers to them. And going back to that rat ode of what are the markers that we say deserve space of being told, that I'm really concerned with the ways with which we say that certain cultural groups and the symbols that they have no place in our national narrative. And I just want to make sure that as we walk through spaces, we realize that there's a lot of macro at play, right? And why things are what they are. But sometimes it's those little things that we say every day that build up as to why someone thinks they have value or don't have value. So we have to be mindful of the stories and myths we are choosing to tell about people, and that we are allowing them to tell about themselves. I want to thank you so much for being here and the work that you all are doing.